Jules Verne's The Mysterious Island, a rare sequel from an author not known for them, and in this case, to 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, his most famous work. If you enjoy this sort of content, I hope you'll remember to like, subscribe, hit the bell icon, and leave a comment. It really helps us out. And don't forget to join us over on Twitch for our readings Mondays, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays at 6 p.m. Pacific. And now, on to the story. Chapter 13. How had it happened? Who had killed the convicts? Was it Ayrton? No, for a moment before he was dreading their return. But Ayrton was now in a profound stupor from which it was no longer possible to rouse him. After uttering those few words, he had again become unconscious and had fallen back motionless on the bed. The colonists, a prey to 1,000 confused thoughts, under the influence of violent excitement, waited all night, without leaving Ayrton's house or returning to the spot where lay the bodies of the convicts. It was very probable that Ayrton would not be able to throw any light on the circumstances under which the bodies had been found, since he himself was not aware that he was in the corral. But at any rate, he would be in a position to give an account of what had taken place before this terrible execution. The next day Ayrton awoke from his torpor, and his companions cordially manifested all the joy they felt on seeing him again, almost safe and sound after 104 days' separation. Ayrton then, in a few words, recounted what had happened, or at least as much as he knew. The day after his arrival at the corral on the 10th of last November, at nightfall, he was surprised by the convicts who had scaled the palisade. They bound and gagged him. Then he was led to a dark cavern at the foot of Mount Franklin, where the convicts had taken refuge. His death had been decided upon, and the next day the convicts were about to kill him, when one of them recognized him and called him by the name which he bore in Australia. The wretches had no scruples as to murdering Ayrton. They spared Ben Joyce. But from that moment Ayrton was exposed to the importunities of his former accomplices. They wished him to join them again, and relied upon his aid to enable them to gain possession of Granite House, to penetrate into that hitherto inaccessible dwelling, and to become masters of the island after murdering the colonists. Ayrton remained firm. The once convict, now repentant and pardoned, would rather die than betray his companions. Ayrton, bound, gagged, and closely watched, lived in this cave for 4 months. Nevertheless, the convicts had discovered the corral a short time after their arrival in the island, and since then they had subsisted on Ayrton's stores, but did not live at the corral. On the 11th of November, 2 of the villains, surprised by the colonists' arrival, fired at Herbert, and one of them returned, boasting of having killed one of the inhabitants of the island. But he returned alone. His companion, as is known, fell by Cyrus Harding's dagger. Ayrton's anxiety and despair may be imagined when he learned the news of Herbert's death. The settlers were now only 4, and as it seemed, at the mercy of the convicts. After this event, and during all the time that the colonists, detained by Herbert's illness, remained in the corral, the pirates did not leave their cavern. And even after they had pillaged the plateau of Prospect Heights, they did not think it prudent to abandon it. The ill treatment inflicted on Ayrton was now redoubled. His hands and feet still bore the bloody marks of the cords which bound him day and night. Every moment he expected to be put to death, nor did it appear possible that he could escape. Matters remained thus until the 3rd week of February. The convicts, still watching for a favorable opportunity, rarely quitted their retreat, and only made a few hunting excursions either to the interior of the island or the south coast. Ayrton had no further news of his friends, and relinquished all hope of ever seeing them again. At last, the unfortunate man, weakened by ill treatment, fell into a prostration so profound that sight and hearing failed him. From that moment, that is to say, since the last 2 days, he could give no information whatever of what had occurred. "But Captain Harding," he added, Since I was imprisoned in that cavern, how is it that I find myself in the corral? How is it that the convicts are lying yonder dead in the middle of the enclosure? Answered the engineer. Dead? Cried Ayrton, half rising from his bed, notwithstanding his weakness. His companions supported him. He wished to get up, and with their assistance, he did so. They then proceeded together towards the little stream. It was now broad daylight. There on the bank, in the position in which they had been stricken by death in its most instantaneous form, lay the corpses of the 5 convicts. Ayrton was astounded. Harding and his companions looked at him without uttering a word. On a sign from the engineer, Neb and Pencroft examined the bodies, already stiffened by the cold. They bore no apparent trace of any wound. Only, after carefully examining them, Pencroft found on the forehead of one, on the chest of another, on the back of this one, on the shoulder of that, a little red spot, a sort of scarcely visible bruise, the cause of which it was impossible to conjecture. It is sure that they've been struck, said Cyrus Harding. But what weapon? Cried the reporter. A weapon lightning-like in its effects, and of which we have not the secret. And who has struck the blow? Asked Pencroft. The avenging power of the island, replied Harding. He who brought you here, Ayrton, whose influence has once more manifested itself, who does for us all that which we cannot do for ourselves, and who, his will accomplished, conceals himself from us. Let us make search for him, then, exclaimed Pencroft. Yes, we will search for him, answered Harding. But we shall not discover this powerful being who performs such wonders until he pleases to call us to him. The invisible protection which rendered their own action unavailing both irritated and piqued the engineer. The relative inferiority which it proved was of a nature to wound a haughty spirit. A generosity evinced in such a manner as to elude all tokens of gratitude implied a sort of disdain for those on whom the obligation was conferred, which in Cyrus Harding's eyes marred, in some degree, the worth of the benefit. Let us search, he resumed, and God grant that we may some day be permitted to prove to this haughty protector that he has not to deal with ungrateful people. What would I not give could we repay him by rendering him in our turn, although at the price of our lives, some signal service? From this day the thoughts of the inhabitants of Lincoln Island were solely occupied with the intended search. Everything incited them to discover the answer to this enigma, an answer which would only be the name of a man endowed with a truly inexplicable and in some degree superhuman power. In a few minutes the settlers re-entered the house, where their influence soon restored to Ayrton his morale and physical energy. In a few minutes the settlers re-entered the house, where their influence soon restored to Ayrton his moral and physical energy. Neb and Pencroft carried the corpses of the convicts into the forest, some distance from the corral, and buried them deep in the ground. Ayrton was then made acquainted with the facts which had occurred during his seclusion. He learned Herbert's adventures, and through what various trials the colonists had passed. As to the settlers, they had despaired of ever seeing Ayrton again, and had been convinced that the convicts had ruthlessly murdered him. And now, said Cyrus Harding as he ended his recital, a duty remains for us to perform. Half of our task is accomplished, but although the convicts are no longer to be feared, it is not owing to ourselves that we are once more masters of the island. Well, answered Gideon Spilett, let us search all this labyrinth of the spurs of Mount Franklin. We will not leave a hollow, not a hole unexplored. Ah, if ever a reporter found himself face to face with mystery, it is I who now speak to you, my friends. And we will not return to Granite House until we've found our benefactor, said Herbert. Yes, said the engineer. We will do all that is humanly possible to do, but I repeat, we shall not find him until he himself permits us. Shall we stay at the corral? Asked Pencroft. We shall stay here, answered Harding, Provisions are abundant, and we are here in the very center of the circle we have to explore. Besides, if necessary, the cart will take us rapidly to Granite House." "Good," answered the sailor. "Only I have a remark to make." "What is it?" "Here is the fine season getting on, and we must not forget that we have a voyage to make." "A voyage?" said Gideon Spilett. "Yes, to Tabor Island," answered Pencroft. "It is necessary to carry a notice there to point out the position of our island and say that Ayrton is here, in case the Scotch yacht should come to take him off. Who knows if it's not already too late?" "But Pencroft," asked Ayrton, "how do you intend to make this voyage?" "In the Bonadventure." "The Bonadventure!" exclaimed Ayrton. "She no longer exists." "My Bonadventure exists no longer?" shouted Pencroft, bounding from his seat. "No," answered Ayrton. "The convicts discovered her in her little harbor only 8 days ago. They put to sea in her." "And?" said Pencroft, his heart beating. "And, not having Bob Harvey to steer her, they ran on the rocks, and the vessel went to pieces." "Oh, the villains, the cutthroats, the infamous scoundrels!" exclaimed Pencroft. "Pencroft," said Herbert, taking the sailor's hand, "we will build another Bonadventure, a larger one. We have all the ironwork, all the rigging of the brig at our disposal." "But do you know," returned Pencroft, "that it will take at least 5 or 6 months to build a vessel of from 30 to 40 tons?" "We can take our time," said the reporter, "and we must give up the voyage to Tabor Island for this year." "Oh, my Bonadventure, my poor Bonadventure!" cried Pencroft, almost broken-hearted at the destruction of the vessel of which he was so proud. The loss of the Bonadventure was certainly a thing to be lamented by the colonists, and it was agreed that this loss should be repaired as soon as possible. This settled, they now occupied themselves with bringing their researches to bear on the most secret parts of the island. The exploration was commenced at daybreak on the 19th of February, and lasted an entire week. The base of the mountain, with its spurs and their numberless ramifications, formed a labyrinth of valleys and elevations. It was evident that there, in the depths of these narrow gorges, perhaps even in the interior of Mount Franklin itself, was the proper place to pursue their researches. No part of the island could have been more suitable to conceal a dwelling whose occupant wished to remain unknown. But so irregular was the formation of the valleys that Cyrus Harding was obliged to conduct the exploration in a strictly methodical manner. The colonists first visited the valley opening to the south of the volcano, and which first received the waters of Falls River. There Ayrton showed them the cavern where the convicts had taken refuge, and in which he had been imprisoned until his removal to the corral. This cavern was just as Ayrton had left it. They found there a considerable quantity of ammunition and provisions, conveyed thither by the convicts in order to form a reserve. The whole of the valley bordering on the cave, shaded by fir and other trees, was thoroughly explored, and on turning the point of the southwestern spur, the colonists entered a narrower gorge similar to the picturesque columns of basalt on the coast. Here the trees were fewer. Stones took the place of grass. Goats and musmons gamboled among the rocks. Here began the barren part of the island. It could already be seen that of the numerous valleys branching off at the base of Mount Franklin, 3 only were wooded and rich in pasturage like that of the corral, which bordered on the west on the Falls River Valley, and on the east on the Red Creek Valley. These 2 streams, which lower down became rivers by the absorption of several tributaries, were formed by all the springs of the mountain, and thus caused the fertility of its southern part. As to the Mercy, it was more directly fed from ample springs concealed under the cover of Yakima wood, and it was by springs of this nature, spreading in 1,000 streamlets, that the soil of the Serpentine Peninsula was watered. Now, of these 3 well-watered valleys, either might have served as a retreat to some solitary who would have found there everything necessary for life, but the settlers had already explored them, and in no part had they discovered the presence of man. Was it then in the depths of those barren gorges, in the midst of the piles of rock, in the rugged northern ravines among the streams of lava, that this dwelling and its occupant would be found? The northern part of Mount Franklin was at its base composed solely of two valleys, wide, not very deep, without any appearance of vegetation, strewn with masses of rock, paved with lava, and varied with great blocks of mineral. This region required a long and careful exploration. It contained 1,000 cavities, comfortless no doubt, but perfectly concealed and difficult to access. The colonists even visited dark tunnels dating from the volcanic period, still black from the passage of the fire, and penetrated into the depths of the mountain. They traversed these somber galleries, waving lighted torches. They examined the smallest excavations. They sounded the shallowest depths. But all was dark and silent. It did not appear that the foot of man had ever before trodden these ancient passages, or that his arm had ever displaced one of these blocks, which remained as the volcano had cast them up above the waters at the time of the submersion of the island. However, although these passages appeared to be absolutely deserted, and the obscurity was complete, Cyrus Harding was obliged to confess that absolute silence did not reign there. On arriving at the end of one of these gloomy caverns, extending several hundred feet into the interior of the mountain, he was surprised to hear a deep rumbling noise, increased in intensity by the sonorousness of the rocks. Gideon Spilett, who accompanied him, also heard these distant mutterings, which indicated a revivification of the subterranean fires. Several times both listened, and they agreed that some chemical process was taking place in the bowels of the earth. "Then the volcano is not totally extinct," said the reporter. "It is possible that since our exploration of the crater," replied Cyrus Harding, "some change has occurred. Any volcano, although considered extinct, may evidently again burst forth." "But if an eruption of Mount Franklin occurred," asked Spilett, "would there not be some danger to Lincoln Island?" "I do not think so," answered the engineer. "The crater, that is to say the safety valve, exists, and the overflow of smoke and lava would escape, as it did formerly, by this customary outlet." "Unless the lava opened a new way for itself towards the fertile parts of the island." "And why, my dear Spilett, should it not follow the road naturally traced out for it?" "Well, volcanoes are capricious," returned the reporter. "Notice," answered the engineer, "that the inclination of Mount Franklin favors the flow of water towards the valleys which we are exploring just now. To turn aside this flow, an earthquake would be necessary to change the mountain's center of gravity." "But an earthquake is always to be feared at these times," observed Gideon Spilett. "Always," replied the engineer, "especially when the subterranean forces begin to awake, as they risk meeting with some obstruction after a long rest. Thus, my dear Spilett, an eruption would be a serious thing for us, and it would be better that the volcano should not have the slightest desire to wake up. But we could not prevent it, could we? At any rate, even if it should occur, I do not think Prospect Heights would be seriously threatened. Between them and the mountain, the ground is considerably depressed, and if the lava should ever take a course towards the lake, it would be cast on the downs in the neighboring parts of Shark Gulf." "We have not yet seen any smoke at the top of the mountain to indicate any approaching eruption," said Gideon Spilett. "No," answered Harding. "Not a vapor escapes from the crater, for it was only yesterday that I attentively surveyed the summit. But it is probable that at the lower part of the chimney time may have accumulated rocks, cinders, hardened lava, and that this valve of which I spoke may at any time become overcharged. But at the first serious effort, every obstacle will disappear, and you may be certain, my dear Spilett, that neither the island, which is the boiler, nor the volcano, which is the chimney, will burst under the pressure of gas. Nevertheless, I repeat, it would be better that there should not be an eruption." "And yet we're not mistaken," remarked the reporter. "Mutterings can be distinctly heard in the very bowels of the volcano." "You're right," said the engineer, again listening attentively. "There can be no doubt of it. A commotion is going on there, of which we can neither estimate the importance nor the ultimate result. Cyrus Harding and Spilett, on coming out, rejoined their companions, to whom they made known the state of affairs. "Very well," cried Pencroft. "The volcano wants to play his pranks. Let him try if he likes. He will find his master." "Who?" asked Neb. "Our good genius, Neb. Our good genius, who will shut his mouth for him if he so much as pretends to open it." As may be seen, the sailor's confidence in the tutelary deity of his island was absolute, and certainly the occult power, manifested until now in so many inexplicable ways, appeared to be unlimited. But also it knew how to escape the colonists' most minute researches, for in spite of all their efforts, in spite of more than zeal, the obstinacy with which they carried on their exploration, the retreat of the mysterious being could not be discovered. From the 19th to the 20th of February, the circle of investigation was extended to all the northern region of Lincoln Island, whose most secret nooks were explored. The colonists even went the length of tapping every rock. The search was extended to the extreme verge of the mountain. It was explored thus to the very summit of the truncated cone terminating the first row of rocks, then to the upper ridge of the enormous hat, at the bottom of which opened the crater. They did more. They visited the gulf, now extinct, but in whose depths the rumbling could be distinctly heard. However, no sign of smoke or vapor, no heating of the rock, indicated an approaching eruption. But neither there nor in any other part of Mount Franklin did the colonists find any traces of him to whom they were in search. Their investigations were then directed to the Downs. They carefully examined the high lava cliffs of Shark Gulf from the base to the crest, although it was extremely difficult to reach even the level of the gulf. No one, nothing. Indeed, in these 3 words was summed up so much fatigue uselessly expended, so much energy producing no results, that somewhat of anger mingled with the discomfiture of Cyrus Harding and his companions. It was now time to think of returning, for these researches could not be prolonged indefinitely. The colonists were certainly right in believing that the mysterious being did not reside on the surface of the island, and the wildest fancies haunted their excited imaginations. Pencroft and Neb particularly were not contented with the mystery, but allowed their imaginations to wander into the domain of the supernatural. On the 25th of February, the colonists re-entered Granite House, and by means of the double cord carried by an arrow to the threshold of the door, they re-established communication between their habitation and the ground. A month later, they commemorated, on the 25th of March, the 3rd anniversary of their arrival on Lincoln Island. End of Chapter 13. Chapter 14. 3 years had passed away since the escape of the prisoners from Richmond, and how often during those 3 years had they spoken of their country, always present in their thoughts. They had no doubt that the Civil War was at an end, and to them it appeared impossible that the just cause of the North had not triumphed. But what had been the incidents of this terrible war? How much blood had it cost? How many of their friends must have fallen in the struggle? They often spoke of these things, without as yet being unable to foresee the day when they would be permitted once more to see their country. To return thither, were it but for a few days, to renew the social link with the inhabited world, to establish a communication between their native land and their island, then to pass the longest, perhaps the best, portion of their existence in this colony, founded by them, and which would then be dependent on their country. Was this a dream impossible to realize? There were only 2 ways of accomplishing it. Either a ship must appear off Lincoln Island, or the colonists must themselves build a vessel strong enough to sail to the nearest land. "Unless," said Pencroft, "our good genius himself provides us with the means of returning to our country." And really, had anyone told Pencroft and Neb that a ship of 300 tons was waiting for them in Shark Gulf or at Port Balloon, they would not even have made a gesture of surprise. In their state of mind, nothing appeared improbable. But Cyrus Harding, less confident, advised them to confine themselves to fact, and more especially so with regard to the building of a vessel, a really urgent work, since it was for the purpose of depositing as soon as possible at Tabor Island a document indicating Ayrton's new residence. As the Bonadventure no longer existed, 6 months at least would be required for the construction of a new vessel. Now winter was approaching, and the voyage would not be made before the following spring. "We have time to get everything ready for the fine season," remarked the engineer, who was consulting with Pencroft about these matters. "I think, therefore, my friend, that since we have to rebuild our vessel, it would be best to give her larger dimensions. The arrival of the Scotch yacht at Tabor Island is very uncertain. It may even be that, having arrived several months ago, she has again sailed after having vainly searched for some trace of Ayrton. Will it not then be best to build a ship which, if necessary, could take us either to the Polynesian archipelago or to New Zealand? What do you think?" "I think, Captain," answered the sailor, "I think that you're as capable of building a large vessel as a small one. Neither the wood nor the tools are wanting. It's only a question of time. And how many months would be required to build a vessel from 250 to 300 tons? Asked Harding. 7, 8 months at least, replied Pencroft. But it must not be forgotten that winter is drawing near, and that in severe frost wood is difficult to work. We must calculate on several weeks' delay, and if our vessel is ready by next November, we may think ourselves very lucky. Well, replied Cyrus Harding, that will be exactly the most favorable time for undertaking a voyage of any importance, either to Tabor Island or to a more distant land. So it will, Captain, answered the sailor. Make out your plans, then. The workmen are ready, and I imagine that Ayrton can lend us a good helping hand. The colonists, having been consulted, approved the engineer's plan, and it was indeed the best thing to be done. It is true that the construction of a ship from 200 to 300 tons would be great labor, but the colonists had confidence in themselves, justified by their previous success. Cyrus Harding then busied himself in drawing the plan of the vessel and making the model. During this time his companions employed themselves in felling and carting trees to furnish the ribs, timbers, and planks. The forest to the far west supplied the best oaks and elms. They took advantage of the opening already made on their last excursion to form a practicable road, which they named the Far West Road, and the trees were carried to the Chimneys, where the dockyard was established. As to the road in question, the choice of trees had rendered its direction somewhat capricious, but at the same time it facilitated the access to a large part of the Serpentine Peninsula. It was important that the trees should be quickly felled and cut up, for they could not be used while yet green, and some time was necessary to allow them to get seasoned. The carpenters, therefore, worked vigorously during the month of April, which was troubled only by a few equinoctial gales of some violence. Master Jupe aided them dexterously, either by climbing to the top of a tree to fasten the ropes, or by lending his stout shoulders to carry the lopped trunks. All this timber was piled up under a large shed built near the Chimneys, and there awaited the time for use. The month of April was tolerably fine, as October often is in the northern zone. At the same time, other work was actively continued, and soon all trace of devastation disappeared from the plateau of Prospect Heights. The mill was rebuilt, and new buildings rose in the poultry yard. It had appeared necessary to enlarge their dimensions, for the feathered population had increased considerably. The stable now contained 5 onagers, 4 of which were well broken and allowed themselves to be either driven or ridden, and a little colt. The colony now possessed a plow, to which the onagers were yoked like regular Yorkshire or Kentucky oxen. The colonists divided their work, and their arms never tired. Then who could have enjoyed better health than these workers, and what good humor enlivened the evenings in Granite House as they formed 1,000 plans for the future. As a matter of course, Ayrton shared the common lot in every respect, and there was no longer any talk of his going to live at the corral. Nevertheless, he was still sad and reserved, and joined more in the work than in the pleasures of his companions. But he was a valuable workman at need, strong, skillful, ingenious, intelligent. He was esteemed and loved by all, and he could not be ignorant of it. In the meanwhile, the corral was not abandoned. Every other day, one of the settlers, driving the cart or mounted on an onager, went to look after the flock of musmons and goats and bring back the supply of milk required by Neb. These excursions at the same time afforded opportunities for hunting. Therefore Herbert and Gideon Spilett, with Top in front, traversed more often than their companions the road to the corral, and with the capital guns which they carried, capybaras, agoutis, kangaroos, and wild pigs for large game, ducks, grouse, yakima, and snipe for small game, were never wanting in the house. The produce of the warren, of the oyster bed, several turtles which were taken, excellent salmon which came up the Mersey, vegetable from the plateau, wild fruit from the forest, were riches upon riches, and Neb, the head cook, could scarcely by himself store them away. The telegraphic wire between the corral and Granite House had of course been repaired, and it was worked whenever one or the other of the settlers was at the corral and found it necessary to spend the night there. Besides, the island was safe now, and no attacks were to be feared, at any rate from men. However, that which had happened might happen again. A descent of pirates, or even of escaped convicts, was always to be feared. It was possible that companions or accomplices of Bob Harvey had been in the secret of his plans, and might be tempted to imitate him. The colonists, therefore, were careful to observe the sea around the island, and every day the telescope covered the horizon enclosed by Union and Washington Bays. When they went to the corral, they examined the sea to the west with no less attention, and by climbing the spur, their gaze extended over a large section of the western horizon. Nothing suspicious was discerned, but still it was necessary for them to be on their guard. The engineer one evening imparted to his friends a plan which he had conceived for fortifying the corral. It appeared prudent to him to heighten the palisade and to flank it with a sort of blockhouse, which, if necessary, the settlers could hold against the enemy. Granite House might, by its very position, be considered impregnable. Therefore the corral, with its buildings, its stores, and the animals it contained, would always be the object of pirates, whoever they were, who might land on the island. And should the colonists be obliged to shut themselves up there, they ought also to be able to defend themselves without any disadvantage. This was a project which might be left for consideration, and they were, besides, obliged to put off its execution until the next spring. About the 15th of May, the keel of the new vessel lay along the dockyard, and soon the stem and stern post, mortised at each of its extremities, rose almost perpendicularly. The keel of good oak measured 110 feet in length, this allowing a width of 25 feet to the midship beam. But this was all the carpenters could do before the arrival of the frosts and bad weather. During the following week they fixed the first of the stern timbers, but were then obliged to suspend work. During the last days of the month the weather was extremely bad. The wind blew from the east, sometimes with the violence of a tempest. The engineer was somewhat uneasy on account of the dockyard shed, which, besides, he could not have established in any other place near to Granite House, for the islet only imperfectly sheltered the shore from the fury of the open sea, and in great storms the waves beat against the very foot of the granite cliff. But, very fortunately, these fears were not realized. The wind shifted to the southeast, and there the beach of Granite House was completely covered by Flotsam Point. Pencroft and Ayrton, the most zealous workmen of the new vessel, pursued their labor as long as they could. They were not men to mind the wind tearing at their hair, nor the rain wetting them to the skin, and a blow from a hammer is worth just as much in bad as in fine weather. But when a severe frost succeeded this wet period, the wood, its fibers acquiring the hardness of iron, became extremely difficult to work, and about the 10th of June, shipbuilding was obliged to be entirely discontinued. Cyrus Harding and his companions had not omitted to observe how severe was the temperature during the winters of Lincoln Island. The cold was comparable to that experienced in the states of New England, situated at almost the same distance from the equator. In the northern hemisphere, or at any rate in the part occupied by British America and the north of the United States, this phenomenon is explained by the flat conformation of the territories bordering on the pole. and in which there is no intumescence of the soil to oppose any obstacles to the north winds. Here at Lincoln Island, this explanation would not suffice. It has even been observed, remarked Harding one day to his companions, that in equal latitudes the islands and coast regions are less tried by the cold than inland countries. I have often heard it asserted that the winters of Lombardy, for example, are not less rigorous than those of Scotland, which results from the sea restoring during the winter the heat which it received during the summer. Islands are therefore in a better situation for benefiting by this restitution. But then, Captain Harding, asked Herbert, why does Lincoln Island appear to escape the common law? That is difficult to explain, answered the engineer. However, I should be disposed to conjecture that this peculiarity results from the situation of the island in the southern hemisphere, which, as you know, my boy, is colder than the northern hemisphere. Yes, said Herbert, and icebergs are met with in lower latitudes in the south than in the north. That is true, remarked Pencroft, and when I've been serving on board whalers, I've seen icebergs off Cape Horn. The severe cold experienced in Lincoln Island, said Gideon Spilett, may then perhaps be explained by the presence of floes or icebergs comparatively near to Lincoln Island. Comparatively near to Lincoln Island. Your opinion is very admissible indeed, my dear Spilett, answered Cyrus Harding, and it is evidently to the proximity of icebergs that we owe our rigorous winters. I would draw your attention also to an entirely physical cause, which renders the southern colder than the northern hemisphere. In fact, since the sun is nearer to this hemisphere during the summer, it is necessarily more distant during the winter. This explains the excess of temperature in the two seasons, for if we find the winters very cold in Lincoln Island, we must not forget that the summers here, on the contrary, are very hot. But why, if you please, Captain, asked Pencroft, knitting his brows, why should our hemisphere, as you say, be so badly divided? It isn't just that. Friend Pencroft, answered the engineer, laughing, whether just or not, we must submit to it, and here lies the reason for this peculiarity. The earth does not describe a circle around the sun, but an ellipse, as it must by the laws of rational mechanics. Now the earth occupies one of the foci of the ellipse, and so at one point in its course is at its apogee, that is, at its farthest from the sun, and at another point it is at its perigee, or nearest to the sun. Now it happens that it is during the winter of the southern countries that it is at its most distant point from the sun, and consequently in a situation for those regions to feel the greatest cold. Nothing can be done to prevent that, and men, Pencroft, however learned they may be, can never change anything of the cosmographical order established by God himself. And yet, added Pencroft, the world is very learned. What a big book, Captain, might be made with all that is known. And what a much bigger book still with all that is not known, answered Harding. At last, for one reason or another, the month of June brought the cold with its accustomed intensity, and the settlers were often confined to Granite House. Ah, how wearisome this imprisonment was to them, and more particularly to Gideon Spilett. Look here, said he to Neb one day, I would give you by notarial deed all the estates which will come to me some day, if you were a good enough fellow to go, no matter where, and to subscribe to some newspaper for me. Decidedly the thing that is most essential to my happiness is the knowing every morning what has happened the day before in other places than this. Neb began to laugh. "'Pon my word," he replied, "the only thing I think about is my daily work." The truth was that indoors as well as out, there was no want of work. The colony of Lincoln Island was now at its highest point of prosperity, achieved by 3 years of continued hard work. The destruction of the brig had been a new source of riches, without speaking of the complete rig which would serve for the vessel now on the stocks. Utensils and tools of all sorts, weapons and ammunition, clothes and instruments, were now piled in the storerooms of Granite House. It had not even been necessary to resort again to the manufacture of the coarse felt materials. Though the colonists had suffered from cold during their first winter, the bad season might now come without their having any reason to dread its severity. Linen was plentiful also, and besides, they kept it with extreme care. From chloride of sodium, which is nothing else than sea salt, Cyrus Harding easily extracted the soda and chlorine. The soda, which it was easy to change into carbonate of soda, and the chlorine, of which he made chloride of lime, were employed for various domestic purposes, and especially in bleaching linen. Besides, they did not wash more than 4 times a year, as was done by families in the olden times, and it may be added that Pencroft and Gideon Spilett, while waiting for the postman to bring him his newspaper, distinguished themselves as washermen. So passed the winter months, June, July, and August. They were severe, and the average observations of the thermometer did not give more than 8 degrees of Fahrenheit. It was therefore lower in temperature than the preceding winter. But then what splendid fires blazed continually on the hearths of Granite House, the smoke marking the granite wall with long zebra-like streaks. Fuel was not spared, as it grew naturally a few steps from them. Besides, the chips of the wood destined for the construction of the ship enabled them to economize the coal, which required more trouble to transport. Men and animals were all well. Master Jupe was a little chilly, it must be confessed. This was perhaps his only weakness, and it was necessary to make him a well-padded dressing gown. But what a servant he was! Clever, zealous, indefatigable, not indiscreet, not talkative, and he might have been with reason proposed as a model for all his biped brothers in the old and new worlds. "As for that," said Pencroft, "when one has 4 hands at one's service, of course one's work ought to be done so much the better." And indeed the intelligent creature did it well. During the 7 months which had passed since the last researches made round the mountain, and during the month of September which brought back fine weather, nothing was heard of the genius of the island. His power was not manifested in any way. It is true that it would have been superfluous, for no incident occurred to put the colonists to any painful trial. Cyrus Harding even observed that if by chance the communication between the unknown and the tenants of Granite House had ever been established through the granite, and if Top's instinct had, as it were, felt it, there was no further sign of it during this period. The dog's growling had entirely ceased, as well as the uneasiness of the orang. The 2 friends, for they were such, no longer prowled round the opening of the inner well, nor did they bark or whine in that singular way which from the first the engineer had noticed. But could he be sure that this was all that was to be said about this enigma, and that he should never arrive at a solution? Could he be certain that some conjuncture would not occur which would bring the mysterious personage on the scene? Who could tell what the future might have in reserve? At last the winter was ended, but an event, the consequences of which might be serious, occurred in the first days of the returning spring. On the 7th of September, Cyrus Harding, having observed the crater, saw smoke curling round the summit of the mountain, its first vapors rising in the air. End of chapter 14. Well, they're still alive. Let's see what happens next, shall we? If you've enjoyed this sort of content, I hope you'll remember to hit the like and subscribe, smash that bell icon, and leave a comment. It really helps us out. Good night now.